Okay, welcome back to part two of chapter one. And before we get going on part two, I just wanted to kind of do a really quick review, talking about some of the definitions as we go through. Remember, ethical issues. These are the difficult social or policy questions that include controversy over the right thing to do. Versus ethical dilemmas. Remember, those are situations in which it's difficult for a person to decide, either because the right course of action really isn't clear or because the right course of action is going to carry some negative consequence with it. Okay? So remember, discretion, the authority to make a decision between two or more different choices. So, and law enforcement and the entire criminal justice system definitely has a lot of discretion. Morals, remember, those are principles of right and wrong. Ethics, the discipline of determining good and evil and defining moral duties. Okay? And then, remember, we had, by definition, we had duties. These are required behaviors or actions. That is the responsibilities that are attached to a specific role. We had values, judgments of desirability, worth, or importance. So a lot of different definitions. And also, really quick before I start, don't forget the matching exercise that you have built into each chapter module that covers a lot of the definitions to help you understand them a little bit and to have a clearer picture. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump back into part two of chapter one. So thus far, we know that morality and ethics concern the judgment of behavior as right or wrong. And furthermore, such judgments are directed only at, voluntary human behavior that affects other people, the earth, and living things. And we can further restrict our inquiries regarding ethics to those behavioral decisions that are relevant to one's profession within the criminal justice system. So let's take a look now at some examples, if you will, ethics of police officers. So here's a couple of examples. So again, we'll have a little discussion regarding the ethics of police officers. For instance, would concern issues such as the following. So the first one would be whether to accept gratuities. So if you don't know what a gratuity is, that's like maybe a free cup of coffee or a half-price meal or something like that. And that's kind of an interesting thought, right? It's just a cup of coffee. What's that going to hurt anything? It's just half off on a meal. So these are things I want you to think about. Again, these are, examples, ethics of police officers. Okay. Next, and it's not on the chart here, but whether to cover up the wrongdoing of a fellow officer. Actually, it is there. It's at the bottom. I missed it. If you saw one of your officers do something wrong, use force inappropriately, etc., how would you handle that? What would you do? Whether to sleep on duty. And you're probably wondering, well, how would you do that? Well, just like any other profession, if it's raining, storming, windy on a graveyard night at 3 a.m, there may not be, depending upon what agency you work for, that many calls to handle. So officers have been known to violate policy and to go park their car behind some building somewhere and relax a little bit. So is that an ethical issue? Is that a dilemma? So again, ethics of police officers. So let's also kind of take a look at, or discuss some ethics, regarding, maybe defense attorneys. So whether to devote more effort to a private case than an appointed case, meaning a private case, meaning one that might pay versus, a different case. Whether to allow perjury. If you're a defense attorney, do you allow your client to lie? Whether to attack the character of a victim to defend a client. Let's say it's a male suspect accused of sexual assault and you know that he's wrong. Are you going to attack the character of that female victim, even though you know that your client is probably guilty, etc.? Are these issues? Are these dilemmas? I mean, they really are. So, of course, these actions affect other people, as do most actions, taken as a professional. So again, you have to kind of think about all of these in context, all right? Okay, so let's now take a look at analyzing ethical issues and policies. So critical thinking skills has become an overused and abused term in education. But in reality, the core idea of critical thinking is to become more cognizant of the facts as opposed to concepts, assumptions, or biases, and use of objective reasoning to most effectively reach a decision or understand a problem. Okay, so Paul and Elder, authors back in 2003, explained that all reasoning is based on assumptions, points of view, and data or evidence, but reasoning is shaped by concepts and ideas that affect our interpretation of the data, which then lead us to conclusions that give meaning to the data. So they outline some things that, when you talk about to be a critical thinker, one must ask some of these questions. So the first one is, what information am I using in coming to a conclusion? What information do I need to settle the question? Is there another way to interpret the information? What assumption has led me to my conclusion? Is there another point of view I should consider? And then finally, what implication or consequence might be the result of this particular conclusion? So, in each of the discussions, as you go through the book and you look in your little dilemma questions that I give you in each chapter, that subject, issues or policies to an ethical analysis, critical thinking is going to be required. And one of the most important elements of critical thinking is to separate facts from concepts and identify underlying assumptions. So those are important things to kind of consider, right? So then, how do we analyze these ethical dilemmas? Okay, and we're going to kind of finish up with how we do that. Recall that an ethical dilemma is when an individual is faced with at least two courses of action and the decision is difficult. So in applied ethics text, various authors have set out the steps to take when facing ethical dilemmas. So you can see here, for instance, Ruggiero, back in 2001, advises us of the following steps, right? And they're very similar to the final ones that we're going to look at as we kind of go through and dissect all these ethical dilemmas. But he tells us to study the details of the case, to identify relevant criteria, determine possible courses of action, and then decide which action is in fact the most ethical. Now, this approach is really similar to the one that we're going to be using throughout this course. So again, I'm going to go through the ones that I would like you to use in determining some of these ethical dilemmas. Okay, so here are the steps when facing ethical dilemmas. And they're on page 17 if you need some more information. So number one, identify the facts. Make sure that one has all the facts that are known, not future predictions, not suppositions, not probabilities, not a gut feeling, but the facts. Number two, identify relevant values and concepts. So concepts are things that cannot be proven empirically, but are relevant to the issue at hand. Understand that your concepts and values may affect the way you interpret the facts. For instance, the issue of abortion not only revolves around the value of life, right? But it is also a concept in that there is no agreement of when life begins or ends, although there are provable facts regarding the existence of respiration, brain activity, and other functions, etc. So I'm just kind of giving you examples. Many arguments surrounding ethical issues are really arguments about concepts that can't be proven. Okay, so this identifying relevant values and concepts is important. Number three, identify all possible dilemmas and then decide what is the most immediate. What do you have to take care of first? So identifying all dilemmas can help us see that someone's own moral or ethical dilemma is caused by others' actions. So here's an example. For instance, a police officer's ethical dilemma when faced with the wrongdoing of a fellow officer is the direct result of the other officer, right? Making the bad choice. But you're still stuck in the dilemma. But it was caused by somebody else, right? So identify all of those possible dilemmas. Number four, decide what is the most immediate moral or ethical issue facing the individual. This is always a kind of a behavior choice, not an option. So, for example, the moral issue of whether, let's say, abortion should be legalized is quite different from the moral dilemma of whether I should have an abortion or find myself pregnant, right? So those are different things. Obviously, though, one affects the other, but conceptually, they are distinct. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then finally, number five, resolve the ethical or moral dilemma by using an ethical system or some other means of decision making. And we're going to look at ethical systems when we get into chapter 2. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of move a little bit forward. All right, so let me kind of finish up and wrap it up for you. So it is really important to note that, let me go back to the first page here so you're not just staring at something there. Okay, so it is important for us to know or take note of that very often the ethical thing to do is clear once you identify the relevant law or policy. So if you find a law or policy, then it kind of makes it an easier decision, right? Because there's a law or a policy. Although there are instances where the law or policy in itself might not be good. It might be, unethical. And in most situations, if something is illegal, it is also considered unethical. Most individuals who engage in, let's say, public corruption know that they are violating the law, but they do it anyway. There is no ethical dilemma involved when a police officer decides whether to steal from a burglary scene, or a prosecutor decides to hide exculpatory evidence. These facts are illegal and wrong, and the individual knows they are wrong, right? And we use ethical analysis when the right thing to do is not clear. Now, why someone chooses to behave in that fashion is something we'll talk about later on. Another type of dilemma is when you know what is the right thing to do, but doing it comes at a cost. The clearest example in the criminal justice system, especially law enforcement, okay, is this situation that, the so-called blue curtain of secrecy, the blue wall of silence, etc., that refers to police officers that don't come forward or cover up the wrongdoing of their peers. All right? Those who, do not and instead come forward and testify against, let's say, a fellow officer, typically face social, ostracism and sometimes even retaliation. And it should be noted that the same phenomenon I'm talking about exists in other professions to certain degrees too. So it's not just law enforcement. It'd be the same thing in any other type of profession where you saw somebody do something wrong, but yet you decided not to do anything about it, right? So it's not just policing. It's very applicable across the board. So to kind of wrap it up, in this chapter, we distinguished ethical issues or policies and ethical dilemmas. We explained why a study of ethics is especially important to criminal justice professionals. And we also kind of took note that not all behaviors would be the subject to ethical judgments, only those that are performed by humans, right, who are acting with free will and that affect others. We also we had some definitions. So we defined the terms morals and ethics as both to relate to standards of behavior, right? Professional ethics deals with only those behaviors relevant to one's profession. And we make ethical judgments, what we consider to be right or wrong, using rationales derived from historical and traditional ethical systems. And these ethical systems, again, we will talk about in our next chapter. So with that being said, that's going to wrap up part 2 of chapter 1, morality, ethics, and human behavior.